Hello everybody, how are you doing? Today we're going to be talking about coastal habitats again. This is our second lecture in our coastal habitats series. And I like talking about coastal habitats because these tend to be the parts of the ocean that we're most familiar with because they're right next to the land. In our last lecture, we talked about how estuaries are formed, that sometimes these are flooded river basins, or they can be fjords that are formed by glaciers, or they can be formed by tectonic activity, all sorts of ways that they can be formed. We also talked about the idea that estuaries mix in different ways, that sometimes we have something called a salt wedge, where salt water stays below the fresh water and they don't tend to mix very well. Or you can have partially mixed estuaries, or you can have very well mixed estuaries. We also talked about the idea of the Chesapeake Bay being an example of a partially mixed flooded river valley estuary that is really important to the United States. And we talked about lagoons and atolls, which are a type of lagoon. So today we're going to be talking about coastal habitats that are a little bit closer to home, and we're going to start with salt marshes. So Georgia has an amazing coastline that is just chock full of salt marshes. And one of the things I think that's very interesting about Georgia is that we have a very small amount of coastline. We only have about 100 miles of coastline, but we have the second most acreage of salt marshes in the East Coast, which means we really have a disproportionate amount of salt marshes. We're full of salt marshes, right? And so we have some pictures of salt marshes here. This is sort of what a salt marsh would look like. If you're looking out over it, and it looks like it's high tide, so someone is up there fishing, right? This is a salt marsh from above, and we can see we have these tidal creeks. We have different types of vegetation. You see how this is a light color and this is a dark color. So we have different types of vegetation. Sometimes it might look like it's just one big, one big monoculture of plants out there, but there's a lot of different types of plants in the salt marsh. We also have all these little tiny creeks in here that are draining off the marsh. And then here in this picture, this is St. Simon's Island. You can see the airport there, and here's the causeway. This is the inlet here, and this is the St. Simon's Village where we have the jetty. And you can see that behind this barrier island, this is just full of salt marsh. And then actually in front of it, separating it from Sea Island and from Little St. Simon's, we have more marsh here. So these are really important to us in our area. So this is one of my favorite ecosystems and habitats to talk about because of that. So what happens with a salt marsh? This is sort of a typical diagram of what we see in a salt marsh. We have the ocean out here, and we have an inlet, right, that's coming in and out. And this says flood delta and ebb delta. This is sort of the buildup of sediment because we have water coming in and out here. Now, what we often will see is we will see tidal flats that will be, so this is deeper water, and then we'll have tidal flats. It'll be like mud flats, sort of shallow areas where we don't have any plants yet. And then we have salt marsh that is growing along. So it's bordering the mainland. And what's actually happening here is typically what you'll see is that you'll see land, so dry land, you'll see marsh growing out from it, and then you'll see mud flat growing out from that marsh. That's a typical pattern that we see. So here we have some of that mud flat area, right, where we have mud flat. We have a little bit of plants in here, but a lot of mud flat, okay? So these plants are very important in growing the salt marsh. So typically what happens is you'll end up with sort of a quiet area, like maybe right over here, where we have a lot of sediment that gets deposited, and you might have one or two plants that will end up there. And they could either end up there just as seeds because these are flowering plants, or they can be broken off a chunk of marsh and they can float there. And that actually happens. It's not uncommon at all. So when you end up with a few plants there, these plants will trap more sediment, which will cause this land to build up a little bit more. So it gets a little bit drier. And when that happens, you start to transition from mud flat to salt marsh. And then these plants will actually send out runners and they will spread, they'll trap more sediment, they'll build more salt marsh. So salt marshes are a habitat that build themselves. They build themselves up from mud flats. One of the really important ways that they build themselves up is through this detritus. So sometimes you have, when plants die, they don't break down because there's not a strong decomposer brigade there. And so when that happens, you can have these plants just fall where they are or float around until they get to a shallow spot. And this is what we see here. This is detritus. And plants will actually grow up on top of these. So if you go out into a salt marsh, what you have underneath you is not really soil. You'll have some mud in there and you'll have some sand in there, but what you'll have a lot of is just old plant material, which is detritus. And if you jump up and down on it, it actually sort of like jumping up and down on a waterbed because it's not really solid land. So you grow from mud flats with a few little plants on them to something that looks like this. This all had been mud flat at one point, and all of these plants grew out from this looks like the shoreline here, from the shoreline onto the mud flats, and then they have these tidal creeks in them that provide drainage. So let's look at this diagram of the stages of development in a marsh. And we have youthful marsh here, mature marsh, and old marsh. And one of the things I want you to look at is that this land in here, or mud, I guess, mud flat in here, it's relatively low here. So we have low marsh and high marsh here, right? This is relatively low, which means that the tide comes in over it quite often. It ends up with rapid sedimentation because the tide is coming in quite a bit. And actually, we have a relatively well-developed drainage system. We have all these creeks in here, okay? But as this starts to grow, look at this high marsh is getting bigger. So this high marsh was right here, and now this is high marsh here, okay? So it's actually growing up because it's trapping sediment, okay? So we have distinct zonation here where we have high marsh that doesn't have very good drainage, and then low marsh that has good drainage. And sedimentation, well, the tide doesn't tend to come up onto the high marsh very much, so we don't have as much sedimentation occurring here. And then as we have an old marsh, look, the high marsh goes way out all the way to here because it's trapped so much sediment. We have, these are old infilled channels where we had these channels and they get filled in, all right? And that they tend to fill in with sand. So you see these pockets of sand, all right? We have poor drainage because these channels have filled in. So it tends to be, water once it gets up there has trouble getting out, okay? And then we have just some low marsh areas near these tidal creeks. So we see this progression from young marsh that tends to be low to high marsh that tends to be higher. Now, one of the things to note is that quite often what will happen is that a mud flat will grow out from here, and then you'll have new young marsh. And so quite often you'll have high marsh that grows out. And that's what has happened here over thousands of years in Georgia. Let's look at an example of salt marsh development in Cape Cod. So Cape Cod, about 10,000 years ago, was covered with glaciers. So these marshes formed relatively recently. So we had really different conditions here in Georgia. We never had glaciers over us, although sea level was a lot lower. We didn't have scouring from glaciers, so our marshes tend to be a little bit different from what you see in areas of the north where we have glaciers. So this is Cape Cod Bay. This is the Atlantic Ocean, and this right here is Barnstable Marsh. And so we have a longshore current that formed a sand spit here, right? We talked about the idea that sand kind of acts like a river. It actually moves along. So this sand spit has grown out here with the longshore current, and behind it a marsh has grown, all right? So our conceptual model of what happened here, about 3,000 years ago, this spit was really, really little, okay? And we had a little bit of marsh that was just in these protected spots here along the land. So the land here tends to be very, very rocky. It has a lot of glacial moraine. So it's stuff that was sort of dragged there by the glaciers and deposited. So this is very, very rocky. But we have some little pockets in here where the water was moving slowly enough that mud flats, sediment settled, mud flats formed, and then low marshes started to grow. As this spit grew outward, the water back in here moved more and more slowly. It was protected from currents, from waves, from things like that. So this was a very, very calm body of water. And so you end up with more sedimentation. So this is what it looked like about 2,400 years ago. The spit has grown out a bit, right? And we have these areas that had been low marsh become high marsh as more sediment is trapped and the plants are building themselves up. So we have more high marsh, we have a little bit of low marsh along the edges, see that? And then this is what this looks like relatively recently, where this spit comes all the way out. Very, very well protected. This is a nice sort of embayment back here. We have a lot of high marsh, very, very well developed high marsh. It has these tidal creeks in it that provide drainage, all right? And then we have some patches of low marsh as well. So cores have been taken of this, where you sort of drill down and you look at what the layers of geological of history tell you. So a core was taken right here, and this is what we see in the core, all right? The core in meters, if you look 2 meters down, the bottom of it is bay sand. The middle part of it is low marsh peat, suggesting that low marsh formed over bay sand. And then we have high marsh peat. And we actually can look in this peat. So there's a lot of, we talk about this peat, it's full of detritus, it's full of dead plants, but it also has sediment in it. And we can see different amounts of sand and mud. So this bay sand, this part here is full of sand, right? And then we get into this low marsh peat, and we have some sand and some mud, all right? And then we get into this high marsh peat, we have less sand and more mud. Well, sand tends to settle because, remember, it has a bigger particle, right? So it'll settle in higher flow environments. So this suggests that we have higher flow here in the low marsh because there's more sand. But once it becomes high marsh, the sand doesn't get up in there. There's not nearly as much sand, and we have a lot more mud in there because that mud is a finer particle. It can stay suspended even when current flow is relatively low. So this is a typical way that salt marshes will form. This is a sort of a classic textbook example of salt marsh formation. What we see in our marshes here, and marshes tend to have a pattern that we see repeated over and over around the world, but our marshes have particular species that will be different from other parts of the world. So we have tidal creeks. We have around that creek, we have a little levee, which is a little bit higher. We have low marsh. We have high marsh. And then we have marsh border and transition, getting up into the land, okay? Now, these have different amounts of water on them. High marsh tends to have less water on it. The tide doesn't get up over it as often. Low marsh, the tide comes onto it more often. And that can be a blessing and a curse. So if you're in an area where the tide only gets up there every once in a while, well, you only have salt water coming onto you once in a while, and that's good. But if you're down here, you might have salt water coming onto you on a regular basis. But the good thing is, because it's coming on a regular basis, it's washing away any salt that might be left over from evaporation. So sometimes this can be just as harsh as this. We do, however, see different plants live in these different places. If you think about zonation that we learned about with rocky intertidal areas or mudflat areas, we see zonation in salt marshes as well. And so what we tend to see here in Georgia, we see in low marsh something called Spartina patens, although there's not nearly as much Spartina patens here in Georgia as there is further north. But Spartina patens tends to do very well in low marsh. It can tolerate being flooded on a regular basis. We have something called Spartina alterniflora, which you see as the first first name is the same, that means that they are the same genus. They're closely related to one another, but they're different species. So Spartina alterniflora is relatively common in low marshes here in Georgia. And then in the high marsh, we see this juncus, this black rush. And you'll notice that it looks like sort of a dark gray field. We see a lot of this in the high marshes around St. Simons. Okay, so these are typical species that we see in Georgia salt marshes. There are some really important species that live in our salt marshes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about these. So one of the really important species are these things called Goekensia demissa. They're ribbed mussels. You can see they have little, like little corduroy that they kind of look like here. And so these ribbed mussels, one of the interesting things we find about them is that the plants that live near them, the Spartina alterniflora that lives near them, is bigger than other Spartina alterniflora. And that's because these ribbed mussels poop a lot. So ribbed mussels and Spartina alterniflora live in symbiosis. So Spartina gives the mussels something to attach themselves to. These guys have little, they tie themselves down basically. So they have little, they're called byssal threads. And the Spartina will give them something to tie onto. And the Spartina will also shade them to keep them cool. And these guys, when they filter feed, well, they take nutrients out of the water, they filter feed, they get the energy, and they use some of the nutrients, but all the excess nutrients, they poop out. And that basically takes nutrients out of the water and makes it available for Spartina alterniflora. So it's really interesting. If you see a really tall patch of Spartina alterniflora, it may have a bunch of these ribbed mussels attached to the bottom of it. We also have marsh periwinkles. These are really, really common. If you go and look at marshes, you'll see these guys. And they like to go up and down, these blades of Spartina alterniflora. And what they're doing is they're actually eating the bacteria that live on Spartina alterniflora. And it's interesting, if you watch these guys, when the tide comes in, they will all crawl to the top of the grass. When the tide goes out, they will go back down, which seems kind of weird because it seems like they would want to be in the water. But what they're doing is they're escaping predation because blue crabs live out here and they love to eat these snails. So these snails will crawl up to the top to try to escape predation when the tide comes in. Another really interesting species that we find in salt marshes are fiddler crabs. And around here we have a lot of what are called Yucca pugulator. There's a lot of yucca species around here, and the males have this great big, see, he's got this one great big claw and one little tiny claw. And these guys do what's called gleaning, and they just look through the mud and detritus for anything that they can find. They might eat bacteria, they might eat plankton, phytoplankton, zooplankton. They'll eat detritus as well. So these guys are scavengers. They'll eat just about any place. And this is a male feeding himself. They're just really cute. All right, we'll move on from him. So a typical coastal salt marsh food web, we typically have plant matter that is broken down into detritus, okay? That detritus can become part of the food web, all right? Not only do we have primary productivity occurring from these guys, and some things are eating this plant matter directly. We also have phytoplankton living in here, and they are primary producers, but a lot of what's being eaten is this actual just detritus, this dead plant matter, all right? So a lot of the detritus is eaten by small invertebrates. We can have crabs, like our fiddler crab. We can have little tiny isopods or amphipods. We have little worms as well. These then, in turn, are eaten by small fish. They either just come into the marsh at high tide and feed, or they will live there. And then we also have large fish. And a lot of these large fish won't live in the marsh all the time. They will come back and forth between the marsh and the ocean. So in that way, they're actually sort of transporting nutrients from the marsh out into the ocean. And that is an important function of salt marshes. A lot of the nutrients that are in salt marshes will be moved back out of the salt marshes by these fish. And a great example of these fish, one of my favorite examples of these fish, are the red drum. So this is a red drum that's being caught by a fisherman. They're a really popular game fish. They're fun to catch. They will come up into the salt marshes at high tide. So they'll live offshore outside of the inlets, and they'll swim in, especially on very, very high tides when the moon is full or the moon is new. And they will swim not just in the tidal creeks, but they'll swim up into the marsh. And here's one swimming up into the marsh, and here's another one. This behavior is called tailing, because a lot of times all you see is their little tail here, right? And so these guys are swimming up into the marsh because they're trying to get their favorite food, which is this guy. So these are swimming up into the marsh on very, very high tides. They're eating a lot of invertebrates. They love fiddler crabs, and a great time to go fishing for them then is very, very high tides. In summer, it only happens in the warmer months. So they'll come up here in summer, and people will literally just wade out into the salt marsh and catch these great, big, beautiful red drums. All right, so salt marshes are one of our local coastal habitats. We're going to talk about coastal habitats that are really interesting because they tend to be found in proximity to one another. So our next lecture, we're going to finish this lecture and start our next lecture as well, talking about mangrove ecosystems, seagrass ecosystems, and coral reef ecosystems. And these all go together as a unit. So typically what we find is, so this is dry land up here. And as we proceed out from dry land towards the ocean, we see a progression of these three ecosystems in warm waters. Although seagrass really, you find seagrass all the way up in the polar areas, but seagrass really, really loves it in warm areas as well. So what we find are mangrove ecosystems. And then as we move out a little bit from land, we end up with seagrass ecosystems. And then moving out even further, we have coral reef ecosystems. All right, so these sort of progress from shallow to medium shallow to deeper. And they can be found all in the same area. So all of these have very interesting functions that are important to coastal areas. So the function of mangroves, they prevent erosion of the land up here. They are an important nursery area. They produce nutrients, and they also absorb pollution. So this is what mangroves do. Seagrass does a lot as well. So it binds sediments. As we have sediment being washed in and out of this area, it will grab those sediments. It's an important nursery area and feeding ground. It also produces nutrients for 3, 2, 1. Seagrass has some really similar functions here. So it binds sediment, which is kind of similar to preventing erosion. It's an important nursery area and a feeding ground, and it also produces nutrients that can be used by ocean ecosystems. And then as we move further offshore, we have coral reefs. They are a physical buffer for the shoreline. They tend to happen further out from the shoreline, so they're a physical buffer. They provide a lot of different types of habitat. They're important for feeding and spawning, and they use nutrients efficiently. So a lot of these nutrients that are produced here come out here to the reef. All right. All of these ecosystems also export things from the ecosystem out to other ones. So the mangrove will will export nutrients. They will also export fish and crustaceans. So if this is a nursery ground, then a lot of the grown-up fish will move out, right? The same thing happens here. All right. We also have exports here from the seagrass, where this is a primary producer, so it is fixing carbon, and that carbon is available for other organisms to use as part of the food chain. And then finally, for the coral reef Coral reefs are really important. They provide protection from waves. A lot of their sediment will actually move into the beach. So if you've seen a really beautiful white sandy beach in the tropics, a lot of that sand is coral. All right. And then finally, we have a lot of fish and invertebrate larvae that will start their lives here, and then they will move to other parts of the oceans. We're going to start by looking at mangroves. We're going to actually start at the shore and move away from land. So mangroves. We do not have any mangroves here yet. But if you were to drive just a little bit further south, you would find mangroves. Starting at about St. Augustine or so, we see mangroves in Florida. So we can see from this map, mangroves tend to live in warm areas. So this is the equator here, right? We find them not too far out of the tropics in either direction. Although down here in Australia, we do find some mangroves because it's relatively warm here, even pretty far south. So they like warm waters. This is a typical picture of what mangroves look like. They have these sort of stilts to them, all right? Not every species has these, but this is a pretty typical thing. These are often called walking trees because it looks like they have a bunch of legs. And these legs, this is what it looks like above water, and this is what it looks like below water. Right? So they have all these roots that come down, and they kind of look like stilts. This provides a very, very stable bottom, a stable foundation for them. All right. If you think about like the Eiffel Tower, how it gets broader at the bottom, or trees that get broader at the bottom, that's because it provides a really, really stable platform for them to grow up. And you're going to need this if you live in a place where the bottom shifts. It's just sand and mud down there and moves around a lot. So mangroves are well adapted to live in this type of environment. Mangroves reproduce in a very interesting way. They actually, when they have their fruits here, there's little flowers here, and they provide their fruits. These fruits will actually stay on the tree and start to grow. And so instead of just having little seeds or fruits, this tree has babies hanging off of it. And these babies eventually get big enough where they drop down and they become these things called propagules. So this is what the babies look like. These are the seeds up here, and they start to grow their roots, all right? And eventually they get big enough that they drop down, pink, and they will float in water just like this. They float standing upright like this until they find, this guy might float over here until he gets onto a mud flat, and he will sink down, and he'll start to put out some more of his little walking roots, right? And we end up with this growing into a new mangrove. Okay, so these guys reproduce in a really interesting way. And if you ever go down to Florida, you see these in the bays. They just float around. If you pick them up and you plant them, you have a mangrove. So let's look at some of the zonation of mangroves and some of the strategies that they use to survive in the water. So trees are not meant to live in water. Trees evolved on land. And living down in water can present some difficulties for them, especially if it's salt water. So all of these mangroves evolved from land plants. They had to come up with strategies to live in this area. Now, anytime you have zonation, if you have organisms that live in a physiologically stressful area, the good thing about that is that they escape the competition. If you're way up here on land where it's dry, it's easy to live up there. So lots of things want to live up there, so competition is really, really high. But if you move down here, there's not much competition because not many things can live here. So they become physiologically tough so that they can escape competition. So mangroves that live further down into the sediment, further down, closer to the tide, have these prop roots, and these allow them to live in soft areas where you don't have mud or sand, you have a shifting bottom, right? This is what these prop roots look like, and it can look like a great big tangle, as you can see. This, you can imagine, this slows down water flow, and it causes more sediment to get captured, which sort of builds this area up. So these guys are a lot like salt marshes where they capture sediment and they'll build the land up. Now on these prop roots, we have these little things called lenticels. These are one of these strategies that mangroves use to help live in an environment that is low in oxygen. It's hard to breathe when your roots are sunk down into water. And so these things are little pores that basically that they breathe through. And all of these prop roots and of their all their branches have these lenticels on them, so they can breathe more efficiently than other trees can. Some mangroves, black mangroves, they have something called pneumatophores, and they look like little, like people call them snorkel roots, okay? And they just kind of look like fingers sticking up. Basically, this tree, all along his roots, he shoots up these pneumatophores, and these help this plant get enough oxygen because this bottom, there's no oxygen down there. So he would suffocate if he didn't have pneumatophores here. So he needs to take in oxygen to respire. He also needs to take in CO2 to photosynthesize. So this is how they get those gases. And then another thing that mangroves do in order to live in a salty environment, they actually will excrete salt through their leaves. So you can see this is the bottom of a leaf, and it's just covered in salt. So they're taking in salt water. They're getting rid of the salt that they don't want, but they're keeping the water that they do want. Those are some of the strategies that mangroves use to survive in a stressful environment. All right, let's just take a look at what happens in the mangrove forest, because it's actually really interesting looking at not only above the water, but below the water, what's going on with these guys.
The harsh conditions of the waves and salty water would kill most ordinary plants in a few hours. Yet the mangroves not only adapt, they create a sanctuary. An extraordinary range of creatures live in a mangrove forest. Some stay here full time. Others come to spawn. 3/4 of all tropical fish are born here. Beautiful and delicate organisms seek refuge. Countless reptiles and birds call these forests home. Other ecosystems nearby, like coral reefs, also depend on mangroves. They filter nutrients and toxins out of the water, improving water quality. Their dense, intertwining roots also provide protection and shelter during extreme weather. When storms, hurricanes, and tsunamis strike, it's mangrove forests that help reduce flooding and coastal erosion. Nothing made by man does it better. We've had to learn this lesson the hard way, because in the last 50 years, the world has lost more than 1/3 of its mangrove forests. We've cleared them for coastal development, aquaculture, and lumber. Tragically, we've underestimated the value of this quiet, unflashy forest that turned out to be one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. But it's not too late. We can still save our remaining mangrove forests and reclaim land for more. This vital ecosystem deserves our respect, and so do the creatures that call it home.
Okay, that tells you a little bit about what lives in mangroves and why they're important to us. I want to show you how mangroves actually can damp down the power of waves. So this is a wave tank. There are waves being produced on one side of the mangroves, and then you'll see what happens to those waves when they go through the mangrove forest. In coastal areas of the eastern United States, you either have predominant salt marshes or predominant mangroves up until about the area where you get to Long Island or so. And then above that, geological conditions change where you don't really have either of these. You might have a few little salt marshes, but not very many. So down here in our area, we either have salt marshes or we have mangroves. And you can see mangroves go to about St. Augustine, and then salt marshes tend to dominate up here. Okay, so white is no mangroves, and this is actually, I can just tell you there's salt marshes there, and down here there's mangroves, okay? But what we're finding is that because the climate is changing, mangroves are starting to walk their way up the coast. So if we look at this figure here, this tells us where mangroves are starting to increase or decrease along the east coast of Florida. And you can see this is about right here is right about here. And you can see up here where you have larger black dots, the amount of mangrove cover is increasing. And it's increasing by a large amount up here because mangroves are expanding their range and becoming more common here, whereas salt marshes are becoming less common. So mangroves are sort of taking over. So if we look at the change in relative mangrove area, when we get to about latitude 27, which is right about here, below that, there's no change. Above that, we see change, all right? Or we see a lot more coming in. So this is telling us that above about 27 degrees of latitude, mangroves are becoming more common. So why are they becoming more common? Well, our climate is changing and things are warming up. So the thing that really defines what allows mangroves to live in a particular area is temperature. So we have here along our x-axis percentage of tidal saline wetlands dominated by mangrove forest. Basically, if it's at 100, it's all mangrove. It's at 0, there's no mangrove. There's something else like salt marsh, right? And what we find is that if we look at all sorts of indicators of temperature, that when we reach a particular threshold of temperature, we find that mangroves become very, very common very quickly. Look at how quickly this line goes up. So minimum temperature, that means the lowest temperature that it reaches during the year. If it gets below -10 Celsius, you can't have any mangroves. If we look at the mean annual minimum temperature, then again, if that mean annual minimum, that means basically if we average out year after year after year, if that goes below about -3, they can't survive. If we look at the mean annual minimum monthly temperature, if that mean annual temperature gets below about 13 degrees centigrade, they can't survive. And then the number of consecutive freeze days makes a difference. Basically, what all of this is telling us is that if it's cold, you don't have mangroves. If it's hot, you do. Okay, so this is the limiting factor for mangroves. Temperature is the limiting factor for mangroves. It doesn't matter how you look at temperature. They're showing you 4 different ways of looking at temperature. These things all make a difference for mangroves. So how is temperature changing for us here on the east coast of the United States? Well, we have 2 maps here. This is 1961 to 1979, and this is the number of days per year with a peak temperature of over 90 degrees. Okay, so this is the number of days it gets up and over 90 degrees. And you can see from 1960 to 1979, the number of days it's over 90 degrees, well, it's only like 75 days here. So like 2 months here in Florida, unless you're in the very middle of Florida, and then it gets pretty hot. And then as you move further north, we might only have 60 days of it here. And then as you get further and further north, they might only get a month of it in coastal North Carolina. And then up in the mountains, you get not very many at all. But look at what's predicted for 2080 to 2099, where here in Florida, you might have over half the year where it's over 90 degrees. So it's going to become very, very hot in Florida. And here in Georgia, look, we're talking about 150 to 165 days a year where it's over 90 degrees. So we're expecting it to get very, very warm here in Georgia. And that means it's likely that our salt marshes will be able to transition over to mangroves. So what we actually are expecting, there's basically, this is one model of how the climate will change, and this is another model. So these guys go together and these guys go together. And up here is presence, whether it's going to be there or not. And this is abundance. How much is there going to be there? So really, let's just look at presence. Under both of these models, we can expect that here in coastal Georgia, we can expect to see that we will have mangroves in upcoming years. Okay, probably in your lifetime, we will see mangroves here. Now, if you live in Jacksonville, you're already starting to think about this. If you have coastal real estate, because some of the laws in Florida are very, very strict about mangroves. Again, you can't just cut down mangroves. You can't just trim them yourself. So if you have a beautiful waterfront home looking out over the marsh in Jacksonville, and you love that view, and then mangroves move in, you better not trim them because you will end up in trouble because of conservation, right? So they're already starting to think about this in places like Jacksonville, where you can expect if you have waterfront homes, your view is going to change over the next 50 years or so. To summarize, mangroves are really important in terms of buffering the coastline. They are really good at living in harsh environments, so they are evolved from land plants, but they have become ocean plants. So they have all sorts of strategies to survive that. And mangroves are really limited by temperature, so we may see them soon. Rather than having salt marshes, we may have mangroves. Okay, so today we've talked about salt marshes and mangroves. I think I'm going to stop there because it's sort of just a natural place. And then our next lecture, we're going to talk about seagrass and coral reefs. All right, so make sure you're answering the questions that are attached to these. And let me know if you have any questions. I hope you all have a good day. Take care.